What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka NYPrepper. In this video, I want to share the safest locations in the United States and the top bug out areas in the United States for preppers. So, this is a topic that I've researched for many years, and I decided to put it all into a video, and I made this map for you guys, and I'm actually going to post this to my website, www.NYPrepper.com, and there's a link to my website in the description below this video. But I want to just share with you guys my thoughts on the best bug out locations in the United States, the safest areas to be when crap hits the fan, when there's a nuclear war, World War III, zombie apocalypse, invasion, whatever, okay? These are the best areas to be when the crap hits the fan. So it took me a little while to put this map together, and I want to just kind of discuss with you what everything means here. So there's three colors that I used: yellow, orange, and red, and the colors didn't really come out super good, but you can kind of tell what the yellow looks like. You have like this orange color here, and you have like a pinkish reddish color. Okay, so yellow is a decent area, orange is a good area, and red is the best area to be. Okay, so yellow third best, orange second best, red the best. All right, so moving on from that, we have these red triangles, and the red triangles represent primary nuclear war targets, and these areas would be hit by multiple high yield surface burst nuclear weapons and would generate a massive amount of fallout in the vicinity. Okay, so these red triangles represent primary nuclear war targets. So going through all these triangles, I'm going to start from east, and then I'm going to work my way to the west. Here in Maine, you have a very important radio relay station in Cutler, Maine. This radio station relays launch codes to our Atlantic fleet for our nuclear armed submarines. So that's a primary target. Then you have the Washington, D.C. area. Lots of nuclear targets there. Obviously, it's the capital of our country, but also you have very important military bases and bunker complexes that surround the D.C. area, like Mount Weather, Raven Rock, Camp David, Quantico, all kinds of bases, guys. Fort Detrick, okay? So the whole D.C. area within 100 miles of D.C. is a primary nuclear war target. And then here in Southern Virginia, you'll notice another triangle, and that's for the Norfolk Naval Base, which is the home of our aircraft carriers. So that's a primary nuclear war target. Down here, you have Kings Bay, Georgia, which is the home of our Atlantic fleet of our nuclear armed submarines, the Ohio class subs. So that's a major target. In eastern Tennessee, you have Oak Ridge, which is a nuclear research laboratory, and this is actually where the Manhattan Project took place and where they developed the first atomic bomb. And then here in Missouri, you have Whiteman Air Force Base, which is home of our B-2 stealth bombers, one of the legs of our nuclear triad. Here in northwest Louisiana, you have the home of Air Force Global Strike Command, and this is basically where the U.S. Air Force commands our nuclear capable bombers. So that's a primary nuclear target. Then you have STRATCOM in southeastern Nebraska, okay, Strategic Command, which is basically the brain of the U.S. military, most important base in the country, and it's centrally located within our country for a reason, okay, and it's underground, and that's Offutt Air Force Base in Lincoln, Nebraska area. Going south to Texas, you have a few different targets here. You have Dyess Air Base, which is home of B-52 bombers, and that's an orange triangle. And the reason why it's an orange triangle is that it's not a primary nuclear war target, but it's a secondary nuclear war target. And then going west of Dyess Air Force Base, you have the Pantex plant in North Texas, northwestern Texas, okay? And the Pantex plant is where nuclear weapons are assembled. It's the only place in the entire country where ICBMs are assembled and where nuclear warheads are assembled on top of ICBMs. So this is a critical base. Here you have an orange triangle, which represents Los Alamos National Lab. That's a secondary nuclear target. And I forgot to mention some of these other triangles here. And up here in New England, I forgot to share with you guys what these orange triangles mean. So you have New London Naval Base in eastern Connecticut, where there's attack subs there. Okay, that's a major attack sub base. That's a secondary nuclear target. And then in Rhode Island, you have some important facilities for submarine maintenance, and they're run by General Dynamics. Okay, so that's a secondary target in the Newport, Rhode Island area. In North Carolina, you got Fort Bragg, all right, home of the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare School, Green Berets, okay. And here you have Warner Robins in Georgia. Okay, Warner Robins is a critical air base for multiple reasons. So these are secondary targets. Continuing with the primary targets, you have a major target here in Colorado. You have Colorado Springs area, which is a major target, home of NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense. And that's basically the military's eyes and ears. That's where all of our sensors that monitor the skies and space get fed into. And so in NORAD, they can monitor all kinds of data from satellites, radars. They're monitoring the whole sky and space. All right. So NORAD is critical in a nuclear war scenario because they would be the first ones to detect any kind of incoming missiles, or if we're talking about a foreign invasion or non-nuclear attack, they would detect foreign military assets invading our airspace, okay? And heading north into Wyoming and southeastern Wyoming and the extreme western part of Nebraska, you have a nuclear ICBM missile field with 150 silos. Each silo carries a Minuteman ICBM with a 1 megaton warhead on it. So each one of those 150 silos would need to be hit directly with a high yield surface burst nuclear warhead. And for good measure, they would probably target each silo with 2 surface burst high yield warheads. So you have 150 silos in this area here, okay, just east of Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so each one has to be hit with 2 nukes, all right? And the reason why they would do 2 is they want to make sure that they completely destroy the silo and make sure they actually hit it, because nuclear weapons do have what's known as a circular error of probability, which is the probability of hitting your target directly, okay? And some of these Russian missiles can miss their target by up to a kilometer. So they would probably use at least 2 nukes for each silo. So that would be 300 nukes detonating just in this area. So any area east of that missile field would have tremendous fallout because the prevailing winds are west to east in this part of the country, but they change depending on the season. All right. Moving north to South Dakota, okay, you have the B-1 Lancer base just outside of Rapid City. All right, that's Ellsworth Air Force Base. It's a secondary nuclear target because it's mostly home to B-1 bombers, B-1 Lancers, which are not considered to be part of our nuclear triad. They're considered a backup bomber, just like the B-52. So they're not critical to our nuclear forces, but they're like a backup. They would still be targeted. Moving north to North Dakota, you have Minot Air Force Base in north central North Dakota. And outside of Minot, you have another missile field with another 150 silos. Again, each one of those silos would need to be hit with 2 nuclear warheads, surface bursted, and a high yield to ensure that they're destroyed. So our enemy would hit this missile field with 300 warheads. Okay, so any area downwind of the Minot, North Dakota area would have massive fallout, all right, for hundreds of miles downwind. Moving west here, you have Great Falls, Montana. That's a primary nuclear target and one of the major nuclear targets in our country. And outside of Great Falls, you have Malmstrom Air Force Base, where there's another 150 silos for our ICBMs. Again, each one will be hit with 2 high-yield surface burst warheads. That's a total of 300 warheads going off in that area. And so between Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota, you're looking at 900 or so nuclear warheads being detonated in this area, okay? And then you have Colorado Springs, home of NORAD, Cheyenne Mountain, Peterson Air Force Base, that's going to get hit with a few nukes, all right? So anywhere downwind of these areas is really bad, okay? You do not want to be anywhere near Colorado Springs. You don't want to be near Cheyenne, Wyoming, or downwind of it. You don't want to be anywhere near Great Falls or downwind, and you don't want to be anywhere near Minot or downwind, okay? Same thing, Stratcom, Whiteman, Kings Bay, Georgia, another major target. And then also in Seattle in the Puget Sound area, you have Kitsap, Bangor, okay, which is a major base for our Ohio-class subs, part of our nuclear triad. That's the home of the Pacific Fleet of our nuclear-armed subs, okay? So you have Kings Bay, Georgia, and you have Kitsap, Bangor, and between those 2 bases, we have all of our nuclear-armed submarines there. And what makes Bangor, Washington even more of a target than Kings Bay, Georgia, is that you have Trident missile storage there. Okay, so they actually store the Trident missiles at that base, probably at least 1,000 of them. So that is a massive target, okay? Going south into southeastern or south central Washington, you have the Hanford site, which is not really a nuclear target, but it's an area that we definitely want to avoid because after a collapse event, this area is not going to be maintained, okay? And the Hanford site is where the U.S. military buried a bunch of nuclear waste during the Cold War, and it's extremely toxic, and it has to be monitored and maintained constantly. And if there's a collapse situation in our country, a collapse of society, they're not going to be maintaining that and monitoring the radiation and making sure that, none of the nuclear waste gets out into the environment. So you don't want to be anywhere near Hanford site. And then going into the spine of the Rockies, we have in the Bitterroot area of Montana, the Bitterroot Mountains, you have Hamilton, Montana, where there's a level 4 biolab, okay? Level 4 biolab there. So that's a secondary nuclear war target. Going south into Idaho, you have Idaho Falls. There's an experimental reactor there. and there's also some nuclear research in that area, so that's a secondary nuclear war target. In northern Utah, you have two secondary targets. You have Hill Air Force Base, which is an ICBM disassembly facility. Okay, and they work with ICBMs. I think they assemble them too, but a lot of that information is classified. And then northwestern Utah, you have the Dugway Proving Grounds, which is kind of like Area 51. All right. A lot of top secret weapons are there, and a lot of top secret weapons are tested there. That's a secondary target. Nevada, you got Area 51 here. That's going to be hit with some nukes. And then in the San Francisco Bay Area, you have Lawrence Livermore National Lab, all right, which is also a secondary nuclear war target. So I covered all the nuclear war targets, and now I want to cover some other areas that we want to steer clear of. Okay, so these stars are just miscellaneous areas that we want to steer clear of, and I already discussed the Hanford site, but here you have the LA area. Okay, the LA area is very densely populated, so you don't want to be anywhere near that area. Yellowstone is another area of concern because of the super volcano, so you don't want to be anywhere close to Yellowstone. You want to give yourself a good berth, good distance from it. Chicago, densely populated area. You have East Texas, multiple cities in East Texas. You have Dallas, you have Austin, you have San Antonio. This whole area is very densely populated. Okay, so you want to steer clear of this area. Florida, you got some big cities here. South Florida is just one giant city. You have Fort Lauderdale, Miami. So you want to steer clear of South Florida and Central Florida. You have Orlando, all right, very densely populated area. Going to the northeast, you have the I-95 corridor from Boston to Philadelphia, and any area in between is heavily populated. This is actually the most heavily populated part of the United States. All right, so Boston, New York City, Philly. Philly's not actually a huge city, but areas around New York City and New York City, you want to steer clear because of all the people. Okay, now I went over the nuclear targets, I went over the areas of concern, and now I want to discuss why I rated these different areas what I did. So I want to just discuss the different areas, which areas are the best, which areas are the worst, and I want to discuss the general threats in an SHTF situation. So the major threat in an SHTF situation is going to be people. You want to locate yourself far away from densely populated areas, and you want to also locate yourself far away from primary nuclear war targets. And in addition to that, keeping away from densely populated areas and keeping away from primary nuclear war targets, there's other threats that we need to consider. You have just nature in general is a threat. If you locate yourself in an area that's prone to droughts, that's not a good bug out location because you're going to run out of water. You're not going to be able to grow food. If you locate yourself in an area that has a lot of fault lines like the West Coast, or you locate yourself in the Southeast, which is an area prone to hurricanes, that's also not good. So these areas are rated according to multiple criteria, okay? Natural threats and man-made threats, okay? And the primary criteria for man-made threats that I used is just floods of refugees from the big cities, okay? The further away from densely populated areas that you can get, the better off you are, okay? That's why you don't see too many highly rated areas near these densely populated parts of our country. There's a few areas that are highly rated close to some big cities, but it's not really common, okay? So as you see, for example, in the Northeast, everything is mostly yellow. There's some areas of orange, but basically the entire eastern United States, the entire eastern seaboard is mostly yellow, which is a decent area to bug out. Some of these yellow areas here are decent areas, but they're not the best, okay? And you can see all the densely populated areas, okay? Florida, the I-95 corridor, East Texas, Chicago, southern Wisconsin, southern Michigan, northern Indiana. This is a densely populated area. And then, of course, you have the LA area, okay? So these areas you want to steer clear of. And then you have your nuclear war targets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the different parts of the country one by one and explain to you which areas of the country you should go to, and if you live in a certain part of the country, which areas in your part of the country you should go to. So right off the bat, when you look at this map, you'll see that the only area in the whole country that's shaded red, which is the best area to be, is the Rocky Mountains. Okay, this is known as the Intermountain West. Okay, this is the most highly rated area in the United States. This is the safest area to be for a variety of reasons. Number one, you have a good distance from any big cities, any kind of densely populated areas, and you also have natural barriers to those densely populated areas. So, for example, the most densely populated areas close to this area here would be the Midwest, Texas, and the West Coast, and you have all kinds of natural barriers and a massive amount of distance between those big cities and the Rocky Mountains, okay? So this highly rated area, the highest rated area in the United States, is going to be Eastern Washington, Idaho, Western Montana, Western Wyoming, Eastern Oregon, Northeastern Nevada, Utah, Western Colorado, Northwestern New Mexico, and Northern Arizona, okay? This is going to be the best area to be, okay? The safest area to be if you're a prepper and you're trying to survive SHTF. This is the best area to be. There's also not a lot of nuclear power plants in the western United States. The East has like 90% of the country's nuclear power plants. So that's also another threat that you don't have to worry about. Another good thing about the Rockies is that there's a lot of game animals. There's good growing seasons. There's a good amount of moisture in most areas. You do have some dry areas. You do have some natural hazards that you have to be concerned with, like heavy snowfall, extreme winter weather, droughts. You know, those are always a concern, but you can find some good areas within this red shaded area where you get a good amount of moisture throughout the year, and you also don't have extreme winter weather. All right, but this is the best area to be, okay, right here. Now you'll notice that I don't have Alaska on the map here, and the reason why is Alaska is actually not a good area to be if you're a prepper trying to survive SHTF. And unless you're an experienced outdoorsman, like very experienced, then Alaska could work for you. Or if you're a native of Alaska, then it could be a good area. But Alaska's not good because you do have some primary nuclear war targets there. Okay, you have some bases there where you have F-22s. So that's one reason. And another reason is the extreme weather. Okay. And another reason is that Alaska is basically like an island, okay, even though it's on land, but economically, politically, it's basically an island, okay? In Alaska, they have to ship everything from the lower 48 into Alaska, all kinds of food, all kinds of goods that they can't produce locally in Alaska. They have to ship from the lower 48. So that means that if there's any kind of food shortage or, if you're just trying to stock up on certain prep items, it might be a little more difficult in Alaska. And then you have a lot of natural hazards in Alaska as well. Extreme winters, short growing season, predatory animals. Okay. So I don't generally recommend Alaska unless you're an avid and experienced outdoorsman, or if you're a native that lives there and you've lived there for a good amount of years, then it's a safe place to be. All right. But I do not recommend most people to just move to Alaska and think that it's safe because it's isolated. Yes, you're not going to have a lot of people, but you're going to have nuclear war targets. You're going to have predatory animals. You're going to have feet upon feet upon feet of snow that just never ends. Okay. So it's the real deal up there. Okay. It's not a joke. So moving on from the Rocky Mountains, I want to share the next best areas to be in the United States. And I'm actually going to start with my home state of Pennsylvania. And so north central and northwestern Pennsylvania is one of the best areas in the eastern United States, along with the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee and Kentucky. And the reason why is there's a number of reasons. Number one, you have good distance from any kind of big cities. So, for example, north central Pennsylvania, which is where I live actually, and northwestern Pennsylvania is equal distance from any kind of big cities. Okay, you have a couple hundred miles of space in all directions from any kind of big city. All right, New York City is pretty far away, DC is pretty far away, Chicago and some of the other cities in the Midwest like Detroit are pretty far away. So north central and northwestern Pennsylvania is your best bet if you live in the Northeast or Middle Atlantic states. And also, north central Pennsylvania and northwestern Pennsylvania, you have very remote hill country, lots of rivers and woods. And that's very important for surviving SHTF. You don't want to have a bug out location in a wide open area where you can be observed from the sky or, from vehicles. Okay, you want to have a concealed location, and it's very easy to conceal your location in hilly, forested areas like the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. Okay, and also hills and mountains are natural obstacles for refugees flooding in from the big cities. Okay, moving over mountains and hills, especially in the winter, is very, very difficult, especially after SHTF when you're not going to have maintenance of roads and you're not going to have the typical support structure to help people out if they get stranded. Okay. So, generally speaking, you want to find remote, hilly, forested country with a good amount of moisture throughout the year, and you don't want to locate yourself close to any major natural hazards like fault lines, hurricanes, tornado-prone areas, flood-prone areas, etc. And moving on from Pennsylvania, you have the Cumberland Plateau in eastern and central Tennessee. And also in southern Kentucky, the Cumberland Plateau extends into southern Kentucky and even into extreme northern Alabama. Okay, so this area is really good because you have a natural barrier from the East Coast. You have the Smoky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, which act like a natural barrier from all these people here along the I-95. All right, so when these people head west to find resources in the mountains are going to be a natural barrier for you if you're in the Cumberland Plateau. Now, another thing to look for when you're selecting a bug out location is your freedoms. Okay, you want to build that bug out location in a state that allows you to do things like stockpile weapons and ammo and suppressors and high capacity magazines. Okay, if you build a bug out location in a very blue state, it's going to be very difficult for you to stockpile a lot of the things that you need to stockpile to survive SHTF. Okay. Some states like California are even making wood stoves illegal, generators illegal, not to mention firearms laws. So places like Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Kentucky, they have a lot of freedoms and they're freedom oriented states. Okay. And so that's something you want to look for. Moving on from Tennessee, the Cumberland Plateau, you have the Ozark Mountain area of Arkansas, Missouri, and extreme eastern Oklahoma, extreme northeastern Texas, and extreme northwestern Louisiana. This whole area is basically like its own mountain range in between the Rockies and Appalachians. Most of the elevations are around 2,000 feet at the most, and this area gets a good amount of moisture throughout the year, so you have good growing. You have a lot of forested areas. It's basically all forests with hills, which, like I mentioned, is the ideal scenario because you have that natural barrier and concealment. Okay. So that's a great area. Also, all these states are freedom-oriented states: Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana. You're not going to have problems acquiring things that you need to survive SHTF, especially firearms, and also other types of personal freedoms like homeschooling, etc. Property laws, that's a big one too, is in a lot of blue states, it's very difficult to build a bug out location because of all the building permits you need and all the regulations involved. All right. And this area is good because it's far away from any major big cities. The nearest big cities here are going to be St. Louis and East Texas, but the Ozarks are a good distance away from those areas. So the Ozarks are a great option if you live anywhere in, let's say, Kansas, Missouri, Southern Illinois, West Kentucky, West Tennessee. So if you live anywhere near the Ozarks, that's going to be your best bet. Okay, this area shaded in orange. Moving to the north, if you live in the Midwest, your best options are going to be northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and northern Minnesota, and also the UP of Michigan. And for obvious reasons, this area is extremely remote, lots of forests, cold winters, which are going to keep refugees from the big cities out, plenty of game animals, lots of cheap property, okay? And most of these states, you have pretty decent freedoms. Minnesota and Michigan are not so good as far as freedoms go, but Wisconsin is still decent, okay? But this is going to be your best option if you live in the Midwest, is going to be the northern Great Lakes states, all right? Northern Michigan, the upper peninsula of Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and northern Minnesota, all right? And then finally, our last second best part of the country to bug out in is going to be the Black Hills of South Dakota and the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. Okay, this whole area here is also a very good area. It's not the best area for different reasons. Number one, it can get pretty dry here, and also the weather is just not great for growing. And you have some pretty extreme winter weather in this area of the country. And also, you could get some downwind nuclear fallout coming from some of these targets here, like Malmstrom Air Force Base or Ellsworth. Okay. So now we covered the best areas, the second best areas. So finally, I'm going to cover the third best areas in the country, the decent areas. We already covered the best areas and the second best areas. Now we're going to do the third best areas in the country. And we're going to start with the Northeast, which is where I live. So one of the third best areas here in the Northeast, you have northern Maine, northern New Hampshire, northern Vermont, and the Adirondack Mountains of New York. This is a great area, but it's not an orange area because all these states are blue states and they're limited on freedoms. They persecute you for being conservative and for being a Christian. So definitely not a good area for preppers politically, and freedoms are limited here. But this is some very remote forested hill country in northern New England here. I've been to these states many times, and there are some really secluded areas, especially the Adirondack Mountains of New York and northern Maine. It's just a massive area with very low population. But the reason why it doesn't get the orange rating like north central Pennsylvania is because, like I said, these states are not pro-freedom like Pennsylvania is, but also you have the I-95 corridor not too far away. And so if there's any kind of crisis, all the people from Boston, Connecticut, New York City, they're all going to head north to this area. This is going to be the first area that they think of going to because it's remote and there's not a lot of people. This is where everybody wants to bug out to and everybody's going to flee to. Another thing, too, is if you're in this area, you're backed into a corner because you have the Canadian border just to your north. So you don't have much room to move here. If you start getting floods of refugees coming from Boston and New York City and they're heading northward, you have no way out. Okay, you can't go further north because you're blocked off by the Canadian border. Your only hope would be to go west somehow and try to make it to north central PA, and then from there possibly go west all the way out to the Rockies and cross over the Midwest. But this area is not good because you're backed into a corner, and there's not a lot of freedoms here, so that's why it's a yellow and it's not an orange. Okay, moving down the Appalachians, you have an area that's really popular amongst preppers. You have West Virginia, southeastern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, and southwestern PA. All right, this area here is yellow and not orange because it's the first place that all the refugees from the big cities are going to go to, especially the DC area. These mountains here in West Virginia and Western Virginia are just super close to DC. I mean, just 2 hours away, if not an hour away. All right, so this area is not good. Western Maryland, eastern or southeastern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Western Virginia. These areas are decent, but they're not orange, they're not good, and they're definitely not great. Okay, they stay as a yellow because of the proximity to the DC area. And then also you have some other cities here in the Midwest. So you're going to get people from places like Columbus, Ohio, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Chicago, Detroit. And the first place that they're going to go is if they don't go north to northern Michigan or northern Wisconsin, they're going to head south to West Virginia or eastern Kentucky. Okay, so that's why this is a yellow and not an orange. Okay, moving down, you have the Smoky Mountains. This is a yellow area. It's not an orange because the Smoky Mountains are too close to the I-95 corridor. This is the first place that a lot of people would bug out to. So it's a yellow because of that. You also have a little yellow area here along the Virginia-North Carolina border. This is the Great Dismal Swamp area. This is a decent area if you live along the coast here because it's pretty secluded and it's pretty far from any big cities. So this would be a decent option for you if you live in a place like Richmond or Wilmington, North Carolina. You could buy yourself a little piece of property here. I would try to go at least 50 miles inland in case of a hurricane. But this is a nice little area for you. Moving further south, we have northern Florida. There's some decent areas in northern Florida, but again, they're going to stay yellow because of the proximity to Orlando and Miami. Okay, and then you also have Atlanta up here, so you're kind of sandwiched in between these two densely populated areas. All right, so North Florida gets a yellow. And then moving into Alabama and Mississippi, you have northern Mississippi and northwestern Alabama. You have some wooded areas there. They stay as a yellow, okay, because of various reasons. You have the Mississippi River, which could flood. And then you also have a lot of extreme weather events in this area, tornadoes, hurricanes. You also have a lot of poverty in these areas. Same thing with West Virginia, lots of poverty. That's another reason why it doesn't get an orange, but it gets a yellow, because you don't want to buy a bug out location in a poverty-stricken area or areas that have a lot of mining activity or former mining activity, because you don't want people breaking into your bug out location while you're away from it. And also, if there is SHTF and you're surrounded by extremely poor people that are not prepared, they're going to be a major threat to you, okay? Especially if they know that you're prepared and you're some rich guy from the city that bought a bunch of bug out property and you got a well-stocked bug out location. Guess where they're going to go, okay? Also, West Virginia, basically ravaged by coal mines, okay? Old coal mines, over 100 years old, underneath the whole state. And there's a lot of groundwater contamination issues. So that's why West Virginia stays yellow. Another reason why West Virginia stays yellow. And then here in southern Alabama, southeastern Mississippi, this is a decent area. If you're in this part of the country, it's decent. It's not an orange level because you're close to the Gulf. All right. So this is a major hurricane area. Lots of hurricanes come through. So that's why it stays as a yellow. But this is a good area if you live in places like Mobile or Biloxi, okay, or Tallahassee. This area is good. And then moving further west, we have eastern Texas and western Louisiana. You have some woods here. This is a decent area. If you're in New Orleans or East Texas, this could be a little safe haven for you. And you'll notice, looking at Texas, Texas doesn't really have a lot of good areas, and there's a variety of reasons why. Number one, Texas is very populated. Number two, it's very hot and dry, and that's not conducive for long-term survival. All right, there's always droughts in Texas. Number three, you have the southern border here, which is just a mess. Okay, you have all kinds of drug activity here, and if there's a collapse of society, you could see cartels moving in across the border. Okay, imagine what would happen to our southern border after a collapse of society, when you're not going to have those border patrol assets on the southern border anymore. Okay, this whole part of the country is going to be overrun by cartels, and just, it's going to be a complete mess. All right, illegal aliens, pillaging and raping. So you don't want to be anywhere near the southern border. Also, if we're talking about a foreign invasion, one of the main invasion routes to the U.S. would be through Mexico. All right. So you don't want to be near the southern border, but you do have the Texas Hill Country, all right, which is a decent area. And then you have the Panhandle, which is a decent area as well. These areas get a good amount of moisture. They have 4 seasons. They have hilly, forested or brushy terrain, so you get good concealment and natural barriers. Moving north, you have the plains. You have North Dakota and South Dakota. This area is a yellow and it's not an orange. And the reason why is because the area is completely flat and it's very dry, so you don't have a good concealment. You don't have natural barriers. The only thing you do have on your side here is distance. All right, South Dakota and North Dakota are very far away from any kind of densely populated areas. So that's a plus. And also you have the extreme winters, which will keep people away. But it is wide open, so there's not a lot of concealment, and it's flat, okay? Also, these areas are prone to tornadoes and extreme blizzards and extreme cold. And also, they're downwind of some primary nuclear war targets like Malmstrom Air Force Base and Minot Air Force Base. So that's why they get a yellow and not an orange, okay? And then finally, our last yellow area is the West Coast, all right? And when I say West Coast, I mean the least populated parts of the West Coast. So you'll see here Eastern California along the Nevada border, going from Yosemite all the way up to Lake Tahoe and Northern California. This is an extremely remote, secluded area, but it stays as a yellow because of the fact that California is very anti-freedom and anti-prepping. So it's not a great place to be for a prepper. If you already live in California and you have to stay in California, then you want to head to Eastern California along the Nevada border, or Northern California. That's where your safest areas are going to be, in these mountains here. You have lots of game animals, lots of fish, lots of moisture. Okay, California has no shortage of rain, which is critical. You don't want to live in a drought prone area. The only downside here is you have fault lines all up and down the west coast, and you also have volcanoes. Okay, so that's why the west coast stays as yellow. Moving into Oregon, again, same reasons as California. It's not really a pro-freedom state. It's not a pro-prepper state, but it is very secluded, and there's just a ton of game and hilly forested terrain. So any of these areas in Western Oregon would be great, as long as you're away from Portland or Seattle. And you definitely don't want to be anywhere near the Bangor, Washington nuclear weapons storage site and home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet of our nuclear armed subs. Okay, you don't want to be anywhere near that. But that's pretty much all of the areas in the country that I think are the best places to go to for a prepper trying to survive SHTF. These are areas you would want to buy land in and build a little cabin. Now, keep in mind, guys, you'll see lots of areas in the country that are not shaded yellow, orange, or red. And those areas that are not shaded doesn't mean that you couldn't survive SHTF there. There's still a lot of remote areas in these places that are not shaded. It's just that they're not as good as the yellow shaded areas, you know. So, for example, my old state of New York, you have the Catskill Mountains, you have the southern tier of New York here, which is not shaded yellow. And the reason why is it's too close to the big cities in the east, but you could still find some decent areas there. Same thing in Massachusetts, western Massachusetts. You have the Berkshires, very secluded area, pretty far from Boston and New York City, but it doesn't get shaded because it's still within easy driving distance to the big cities, Boston, New York City. But, you know, you could still find a nice secluded cabin in a quiet valley somewhere, tucked away behind mountains in the Berkshires or in the Catskills or in the southern tier or in the Poconos, or many areas that are not shaded. You could still find a decent area. Okay, so don't get discouraged. You know, if you live in Kansas and you see that, oh man, you know, my whole state is not shaded any color, that's bad. Don't get discouraged. That doesn't mean it's the end of the world. You could still find a decent area and you could still survive. It's just not the best area, okay? Now, Nebraska and Kansas are going to be downwind of these major nuclear war targets, okay? So that's why they're not shaded any color, all right? And most of the Midwest doesn't get any coloration because it's mostly wide open farmland and you have big cities scattered throughout. So that's why it doesn't get shaded. But again, you could still find some forested areas here in Indiana or Illinois or Ohio or Iowa. You could still find some areas that are pretty good, okay? So don't get discouraged. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I hope this video helped you out. I'm going to be uploading this to my website with a detailed description of all of the nuclear war targets and all of the threats. But that's pretty much it for this one, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care. God bless. And don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.